Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson destroyed opponents in under 2 minutes. So why did he fall apart the moment someone fought back? His rise was built on fear. He overwhelmed fighters with speed, power, and pressure. Most were finished before the first round ended, or even began. But Tyson's style relied on control. Once that control slipped, so did everything else. It happened in 1990. Buster Douglas wasn't supposed to last a round, but he didn't fold. He stayed calm, worked behind a jab, and returned fire with discipline. Tyson grew frustrated. His corner had no answers. His defense broke down. By round 10, he was knocked out, but mentally, he'd been done for a while. And it wasn't just one bad night. Against Evander Holyfield, Tyson was bullied on the inside, outworked, and picked apart. In the rematch, he bit Holyfield's ear. It was desperation. When dominance was denied, Tyson unraveled. This pattern never changed. Once a fight slipped out of his control, Tyson rarely regained it. He didn't have a second gear, no comeback plan, no plan B. And his resume shows it. He never won a fight where he was losing midway through. He wasn't weak, but when the fear stopped working, he didn't know what to do next. Tyson didn't lose when he got hit. He lost when someone hit back and kept coming. Gervonta Davis. Davis doesn't throw much early, and most of the time, no one makes him pay for it. Gervonta Tank Davis has built a reputation as one of boxing's most devastating finishers. He carries fight-ending power in both hands with the ability to time a single shot that changes everything. But his most consistent habit is what happens before that moment. He starts slow, throws very little, and gives away early rounds. This isn't due to lack of fitness or fear. Davis is calculating. He studies his opponent's timing, looks for patterns, and holds back volume until he sees an opening. But in doing so, he often allows less skilled fighters to rack up points, control tempo, and gain early confidence. You can see it clearly against Mario Barrios. Through 6 rounds, Barrios was the busier fighter, winning rounds on activity alone. Davis barely threw combinations. But when the second half of the fight began, he opened up and stopped Barrios in the 11th. The comeback was dramatic, but it didn't need to be a comeback at all. Against Rolly Romero, it was similar. Davis waited, circled, and barely engaged for 5 rounds. Romero had success just by doing more. Then in the 6th, one left hand ended it. Impressive, but again, Davis gave away half the fight waiting for the perfect shot. The problem is risk. If the knockout doesn't come, Davis may not have built enough of a lead to win a decision. Against smarter, more disciplined opponents, his low output could cost him on the cards. He hasn't paid for it yet, but the window is there. Davis doesn't need many chances to win. But when the fight is in someone else's hands early on, he's gambling with rounds he may not get back. Alexander Usyk. Usyk keeps winning, but no one's afraid of his power. Alexander Usyk is one of the most skilled technicians in modern boxing. A former undisputed cruiserweight champion, he moved up to heavyweight and outboxed men 20 to 30 pounds heavier without losing his rhythm. His footwork is unmatched in the division. His timing, feints, and angles frustrate even the most seasoned opponents. But at heavyweight, there's one thing he hasn't brought with him: knockout power. At cruiserweight, Usyk had enough pop to keep opponents cautious. At heavyweight, that changed. The punches still land clean, but the impact doesn't alter behavior. Fighters keep coming forward. They make mistakes, but they don't pay for them the same way they might against a bigger puncher. You could see it in both fights with Anthony Joshua. Usyk clearly outboxed him, especially in the final rounds of their first meeting. But he couldn't drop him, couldn't hurt him enough to force a shift in tempo. Joshua stayed dangerous through all 12 rounds. The threat was never removed. Even against Daniel Dubois, a younger, less refined fighter, Usyk couldn't diffuse the pressure. He won the fight on skill, but the lack of power made the exchanges tense. One mistake could still change everything. The flaw isn't technical, it's physical. Usyk does nearly everything right, but he doesn't have the one-punch authority to make heavyweights second-guess themselves. And in a division where one clean shot can end a fight, that limitation could eventually matter. Canelo Alvarez. Canelo has one of the most refined skill sets in modern boxing. He's a master of head movement, upper body rhythm, and counterpunching. He's elite almost everywhere, except when it comes to moving and letting his hands go. Canelo rarely fights at a fast pace, and there's a reason for that. This isn't about conditioning. Canelo has excellent stamina when fighting at his rhythm. The issue is stylistic. He fights deliberately, planting his feet, slipping shots, and looking for clean counters. That makes him incredibly efficient, but it also means he doesn't chase. He doesn't press. If an opponent won't stand still, Canelo won't force the action. That problem became visible in 2013 against Floyd Mayweather. Canelo was younger, bigger, and stronger, but Floyd's movement shut him down. He couldn't close distance. He had to reset constantly. Even when he landed, he couldn't build on it. Mayweather exposed how Canelo struggles against fighters who refuse to engage on his terms. Years later, the same issue resurfaced. In 2022, Canelo moved up to face Dimitri Bivol. Bivol kept things simple: jab, move, reset. He didn't trade recklessly, he didn't sit in the pocket, and Canelo couldn't catch up. He threw fewer punches, landed at a lower rate, and looked visibly frustrated as the rounds slipped away. Canelo thrives against flat-footed opponents. Give him a target and he'll break it down. But against slick movers who set a faster pace, his low volume and limited foot speed become hard to ignore. When the tempo shifts, he has no easy answer. Tyson Fury. He can outbox anyone on the planet, but when the cameras are off, something always slips. Tyson Fury is one of the most naturally gifted heavyweights in modern history. At 6'9", he moves like a middleweight, slipping punches, switching stances, and dictating pace with footwork and feints. But for all the talent, his biggest fight has always been with consistency. It's not about what happens during training camp, it's about whether the training camp even happens the way it's supposed to. After dethroning Vladimir Klitschko in 2015, Fury should have owned the division. Instead, he spiraled. He disappeared from boxing for nearly 3 years, battled addiction, ballooned in weight, and lost all his titles without a single punch being thrown. It was the first major breakdown, but not the last. Even after his comeback, discipline remained a moving target. Ahead of the Deontay Wilder trilogy, Fury gave conflicting accounts of his preparation, sometimes claiming elite focus, other times admitting to skipping road work and eating poorly. Between major fights, he went long stretches without training, reportedly gaining 40 to 50 pounds. That kind of fluctuation doesn't just affect performance, it shortens careers. And when he overlooks opponents, it shows. In 2023, Fury took on former UFC champion Francis Ngannou in what was supposed to be a tune-up, but he entered the ring out of shape and unfocused, and got dropped in the 3rd round. He escaped with a split decision, but not without damage to his image. Fury has the skills to dominate the era, but domination requires repetition, structured camps, consistent conditioning, and professional discipline. When he's locked in, he looks untouchable, but over the course of his career, that version of Fury has been the exception, not the rule. Lennox Lewis. When Lennox Lewis lost, it wasn't gradual, it was sudden and always early. Lewis is widely considered one of the most intelligent and complete heavyweights of the modern era. He used his reach, timing, and discipline to control opponents from the outside. He could fight tall, clinch when needed, and shut down exchanges before they began. But his career carried one consistent vulnerability, a shaky chin that could betray him before he even settled into the fight. It happened again in 2001, this time against Hasim Rahman. Lewis was in South Africa, possibly overlooking his opponent and training at high altitude for a fight he didn't fully respect. In round 5, a single right hand flattened him. Another early knockout, another reminder that technical skill couldn't protect him from a perfectly placed shot. To his credit, Lewis learned. He rematched and beat both men convincingly, but the blueprint had been written. Pressure him early, land clean, and you might not need a second chance. Even in victory, Lewis could look shaky in the opening rounds, tight, tentative, and vulnerable to surprise. He retired as the lineal champion, having beaten every man he ever faced. But no matter how polished he became, that one risk never fully disappeared. One clean punch early on could still bring it all crashing down. Terence Crawford. He rarely wins the early rounds on the cards, and no one talks about it. Terence Crawford is arguably the most complete boxer of his generation. He can switch stances mid-round, adjust on the fly, and dismantle opponents piece by piece. His finishing instincts are elite, his timing razor sharp, and his fight IQ is rarely matched. But across multiple fights, one trend has quietly followed him: a tendency to start slow. Crawford often uses the first 2 or 3 rounds to gather data. He fights cautiously, probes with jabs, and studies his opponent's rhythm. It's not hesitation, it's calculation. But in doing so, he often gives away early rounds. On scorecards, he's frequently behind after the first third of a fight. Against lower-level opponents, it hasn't mattered. Once he locks in, the momentum shifts violently in his favor. But the risk is real. Elite opponents don't always let you catch up. You saw it against Egidijus Kavaliauskas in 2019. Crawford took unnecessary shots early, even getting momentarily stunned in the 3rd round. He recovered and eventually broke Kavaliauskas down, but the opening exposed the danger of giving ground too freely. Even against Shawn Porter, a pressure fighter with a more physical style, Crawford didn't truly take over until round 8. Up until that point, Porter had success crowding him, getting off first, and setting the pace. Once Crawford flipped the switch, the fight was over quickly, but he allowed it to be close longer than necessary. Crawford's mid-fight dominance is what defines him, but his early round patience, while strategic, leaves a window. Against the wrong opponent, on the wrong night, that slow start could become something he can't recover from. Floyd Mayweather. For all his dominance, Mayweather rarely chased knockouts, and his hands had a lot to do with that. Floyd Mayweather built his legacy on precision, defense, and control. He made elite fighters miss, picked them apart with sharp counters, and dictated the pace of nearly every fight he was in. But one of the least discussed factors shaping his style was physical. Throughout much of his career, Mayweather dealt with chronically fragile hands. Early on, it wasn't as obvious. In his first 18 fights, he scored 13 knockouts. His power was clean, especially at 130 pounds. But as he moved up in weight and the damage to his hands accumulated, his style shifted. He stopped sitting down on punches. He started favoring placement over power. He would land flush, but not follow up with volume. The issue wasn't just discomfort. Mayweather had multiple documented hand injuries, including breaks and recurring soreness that affected his training camps and fight night performance. In interviews, he often mentioned having to scale back power shots during fights to avoid worsening the pain. By the time he fought Oscar De La Hoya in 2007, his transformation was complete. He had become a defensive specialist who won rounds with efficiency, not a knockout artist. Against bigger opponents like Miguel Cotto or Canelo Alvarez, his game plan was never to overwhelm. It was to outthink. And even when he landed clean, he rarely pressed for stoppages. Mayweather compensated with technique. His hands didn't need to be heavy when his timing was perfect. But the shift wasn't purely tactical. It was physical necessity. He had the mind, the reflexes, and the footwork, but he didn't always have the tools to finish a fight the way most champions do. Naoya Inoue. Why does one of boxing's most precise punchers keep getting caught mid-combination? Inoue is known for controlled violence. He breaks opponents down with speed, accuracy, and perfect placement. His footwork is sharp, his setups are smart, and his timing is elite. But when he opens up, when he commits to his signature multi-punch bursts, his defense briefly disappears. And that's when sharp opponents land. Inoue doesn't potshot, he commits. When he goes on offense, he stays in range, throws in sequence, and often finishes combinations in the pocket. That's what makes him effective. But it also creates a window, because while he's focused on landing the third or fourth shot, he's not fully guarding against what's coming back. You saw it against Nonito Donaire in 2019. Inoue dominated large stretches of the fight, but in the second round, Donaire timed a perfect counter during an exchange. It fractured Inoue's orbital bone and shifted the tone of the fight. Inoue still won, but he was forced to fight cautiously for the next 10 rounds. This flaw hasn't cost him a loss, but it's a pattern. Inoue's been clipped mid-combination in other fights too, including brief moments against Jason Maloney and Aaron Depayan. The counters didn't change the outcome, and as he moves into higher weight classes, where opponents hit harder and can absorb more punishment, that vulnerability becomes more dangerous. It's not a flaw in mechanics, it's a byproduct of aggression. Inoue takes calculated risks to overwhelm opponents, but in doing so, he sometimes gives them a chance to strike. His combinations win fights, but inside those combinations, there's a moment where he can be hit clean. Evander Holyfield. Holyfield had the heart of a warrior, but sometimes that was the problem. Known for his grit, durability, and will to win, Evander Holyfield made his name by stepping into fire and refusing to back down. He moved up from cruiserweight to heavyweight and beat men who were naturally bigger, stronger, and heavier. But the same mindset that made him great also made his career far harder than it needed to be. Holyfield had the technical skills to box at range, control tempo, and avoid damage. But he rarely fought that way. Instead, he welcomed exchanges. He turned tactical bouts into brawls even when he didn't have to. It was a conscious choice. He wanted to test himself, to break his opponents mentally and physically. But in doing so, he took punishment that added up. You see it throughout his career. Against Riddick Bowe, he fought 3 wars that drained both fighters. The first bout alone featured nearly 2,000 punches thrown. Holyfield lost that fight and won the rematch, but both men paid a price in accumulated damage. The trilogy became legendary, but it shortened careers. It was the same story against Mike Tyson. Holyfield didn't just beat Tyson. He stood in front of him, absorbed power shots, and gave them right back. The win was decisive, but the damage was real. Over time, Holyfield's reflexes slowed, his speech became slurred, and concerns about long-term health began to surface. Holyfield could have made things easier. He had the ring IQ and footwork to avoid many of the wars he chose to enter, but he rarely backed off. If a fight could become a battle, he leaned in. It made him a legend.